My husband and I had been together for 12 years. We built the life, a home, a future. But after his best friend's messy divorce, his mother planted a seed of doubt in his mind. What if I was just a gold digger, waiting for my moment to strike? His solution? To put me on a humiliating $1,000 monthly allowance to test my loyalty. He thought he was being smart. He had no idea he was destroying our marriage. My husband, Jake, decided to put me on a $1,000 monthly allowance as a way to test my character, to determine if I was, in fact, a gold digger. This decision came after 12 years together, 12 years of shared history and mutual support. His mother, a woman whose influence I had always underestimated, had convinced him this was a prudent course of action, a necessary financial stress test for our marriage, despite the fact that in over a decade, I had never once demonstrated anything less than complete responsibility with our shared finances. So, this is how our life, the one we built from the ground up since we were kids in college, began to unravel. Jake and I were a textbook college romance. We met during freshman orientation, a couple of wide-eyed 18-year-olds trying to navigate the sprawling campus and the newfound freedom. We dated all through school, got married in a simple ceremony right after graduation, and stepped into adulthood hand in hand. It was a standard, comfortable love story. He had always been exceptionally close with his family, particularly his mother, Linda. She was a woman from a bygone era, one of those mothers who, even after her son was a married man in his 30s, would insist on doing his laundry when we visited, and who maintained a daily phone call schedule with him that was as reliable as the sunrise. I found it a bit strange, a little too enmeshed for my comfort, but I chalked it up to a different kind of family dynamic and let it be. Family is family, after all. The catalyst for our implosion arrived about 6 months ago, not from within our marriage, but from the wreckage of another. Jake's best friend, Marcus, went through a divorce that was nothing short of brutal. His wife, Emma, had been a stay-at-home mother for 5 years, and when their marriage fell apart, she, quite rightly, sought what she was legally owed. Marcus, however, framed it as a hostile takeover. Emma, he claimed, took him to the cleaners. She got the house, a significant portion of his 401k, and spousal support for 3 years. The entire ordeal left Marcus financially devastated and emotionally shattered, forced to live in his brother's basement because he couldn't afford a place of his own. Jake was profoundly shaken by his friend's experience. He had always heard Marcus speak of Emma in glowing terms as this sweet, loving, and supportive partner. Then, seemingly overnight, she had transformed into this ruthless adversary, armed with a shark of a lawyer, methodically dismantling the life they had built. It was around this same time that I began to broach a subject with Jake that had been on my mind for a while: the possibility of me not returning to work after we eventually had children. I have a respectable career and I make a decent living, around $52,000 a year as a project manager for a marketing firm. Jake, an engineer, brings in about $94,000. Together, we are comfortable. We're not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we live a pleasant, middle-class life in a quiet suburb outside of Denver. We own a modest 3-bedroom house that we bought 2 years ago. We are, for all intents and purposes, the definition of normal. But my desire to be a stay-at-home mother wasn't born from a desire to escape work. It was a reaction to my own upbringing. I grew up in a household where both of my parents worked demanding, full-time jobs. And, to be perfectly honest, our home life was pure chaos. My brother, sister, and I were latchkey kids from the age of 8. Our afternoons were unsupervised, our dinners were often frozen and microwaved, and I learned to be self-sufficient at an age when I should have still been learning long division. I don't resent my parents. They did what they had to do. But I want something different for my own children. I want to be the one at the school gate for pickup, the one cheering from the sidelines at soccer practice. I want to be present for all the small, mundane moments that my parents, trapped in the grind of their 50-hour work weeks, inevitably missed. I brought this up with Jake one quiet evening. We were curled up on the couch, watching a true crime documentary on Netflix. In a moment of casual intimacy, I just mentioned it. You know, I said, when we have kids, I've been thinking I might want to stay home with them, at least for the first few years. His reaction was tepid, at best. We'd have to crunch the numbers, he said, his eyes still glued to the screen. We'd need to see if we could really afford to live on just one income. It was a fair and practical response. But then, in a move that would prove to be catastrophic, he went and told his mother about our conversation. And Linda, it turned out, had some very strong opinions on the matter. She called me the very next day, a highly unusual occurrence. She always called Jake, using him as the conduit for all family communication. She asked if I was free to have lunch with her. I agreed, naively assuming she wanted to discuss plans for Jake's upcoming birthday party or some other innocuous family matter. Linda has worked as a dental hygienist at the same practice for over 15 years. She's a woman of routine and rigid beliefs. Our relationship had always been polite, but there was a distinct lack of warmth, a formal distance she always maintained. Our lunch began with the usual pleasantries. We ordered salads, made small talk about the unseasonably warm weather, and exchanged brief updates about our jobs. Then, as soon as the waiter had placed our iced teas on the table, she launched her offensive. She told me she was concerned about my sudden interest in not working. She asked, her tone dripping with condescending sweetness, if I was certain I wasn't just looking for an easy way out of adult responsibilities. She then brought up Marcus and Emma's divorce, using their personal tragedy as a cautionary tale. She said she hoped I wasn't planning to take advantage of Jake's good nature and generous income. I was completely blindsided, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. I managed to stammer that her assumptions were completely off base, that my desire to stay home was about being a present and involved mother, not about freeloading off my husband. She gave me a long, evaluative look, a look that said she didn't believe a word I was saying. Well, she said, delivering the final, poisonous blow. Emma said all the same things to Marcus, and look how that turned out for him. The rest of the lunch was excruciatingly awkward. I went home and immediately recounted the entire conversation to Jake, fully expecting him to be furious with his mother for her blatant overreach and insulting accusations. Instead, he became quiet and defensive. Maybe she has a point, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Maybe we do need to be careful. In the weeks that followed, Linda's campaign of insinuation intensified. Every family gathering became an opportunity for her to drop a passive-aggressive comment. When Jake mentioned our desire to renovate the master bathroom, she would chime in, "Well, you'll need to save a lot of extra money for that if you're going to be the only one working soon." When I would share a story about a project at my job, she would feign surprise. "Oh, you still have a job? I thought you were planning to quit." It was a constant, insidious drip of poison, and Jake did absolutely nothing to stop it. He would change the subject or offer a weak, non-committal laugh, but he never once told his mother to back off, to respect me, to stay out of our marriage. I could see the paranoia she was cultivating taking root in him, his demeanor toward me slowly shifting, becoming more guarded, more suspicious. The breaking point, the moment the situation devolved from frustrating to utterly unacceptable, came about 3 weeks ago. Jake sat me down after dinner, his face grim. He told me that he'd been doing a lot of thinking about his mom's concerns and about what had happened to Marcus. He announced that he wanted to be proactive about protecting himself financially. He said that if I was serious about my desire to one day not work, then I should be able to prove my financial competence by managing our household expenses on a reasonable budget. Then he laid out his plan. He was going to give me a $1,000 monthly allowance. This money was to cover everything: groceries, household supplies, gas for my car payment, my car insurance, and all of my personal expenses, toiletries, clothes, lunches out with friends, everything. The only expenses not included were the mortgage and the utilities. This, he explained, would be a test. It would help me learn to budget properly and prove that I could manage money responsibly before we made any major life decisions. Prove myself? I asked, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. What exactly do you mean by that? It means exactly what it sounds like, he said, his voice cold and detached. He wanted to see if I could adhere to a strict budget without, in his words, going crazy with spending, as Emma had apparently done. He laid out the terms of his experiment. If I could successfully manage on the $1,000 a month allowance for 6 months, then, and only then, could we maybe talk about me staying home when we had kids. Let's be clear, $1,000 a month is not a lot of money to cover what he was demanding. Our average grocery bill alone is between $400 and $500 a month. My car payment is $280. My car insurance is $95. That left me with, at most, a couple of $100 to cover gas, toiletries, clothes, haircuts, doctor's copays, and any semblance of a social life. It was technically doable, but it was designed to be a struggle. We have been together for 12 years. We have shared a joint bank account for nearly a decade. I have never been financially irresponsible. The most extravagant purchase I had made in the past year was a $200 winter coat, and I had discussed it with him before I bought it, even though it was technically our shared money. Do you really think I'm the kind of person who would use you for your money and then leave you high and dry? I asked him, my voice pleading for him to see the absurdity of this. I don't want to think that, he said, but Marcus didn't think Emma would do it either. Better safe than sorry. His mother, of course, has been championing this whole demeaning exercise as smart financial planning. She told Jake she was proud of him for thinking ahead and not being naive like Marcus. She keeps making these sweeping pronouncements about how modern women don't understand the value of money because everything is just handed to them. I have now been living under this allowance system for 3 weeks, and I despise every single moment of it. On the first of the month, Jake transfers $1,000 into a separate checking account that only I use, and that is my entire financial world. He monitors the account balance like a hawk. He questions my purchases. Last week, I spent $60 at Target on cleaning supplies because we were out of everything from laundry detergent to toilet paper. He saw the charge and demanded to know why I had spent so much. I had to produce the receipt and justify each item on the list. It was a profoundly humiliating experience, one that transported me back to being a teenager, begging my parents for lunch money. My friends are appalled. My sister, Emmy, says that Jake's behavior is a massive red flag, that he's being controlling, and that I need to put my foot down. But a small, beaten down part of me wonders if I'm overreacting. Linda does have a point about being careful. Marcus's life was genuinely upended, and Jake witnessed that trauma firsthand. I can understand the fear, the paranoia. But I am not Emma. And Jake, of all people, should know that. He knows my history, my work ethic, my character. We weathered the storms of college together. We celebrated each other's first career milestones. We pooled our life savings to buy a house. Why does none of that 12 years of shared history count for anything? Is this just the normal, albeit extreme, reaction of a man who is terrified of being taken advantage of? Or is this a sign of a much deeper problem, a fundamental lack of trust and respect? The strangest part is that in every other aspect, our relationship remains unchanged. We still laugh at the same stupid movies, we still have engaging conversations about politics and our dreams for the future. Our physical intimacy is as strong as ever. But this money issue hangs over us like a dark, oppressive cloud, tainting everything. I feel like I'm constantly being tested, like he's just waiting for me to fail so he can say, "See, I was right to be suspicious." I just don't know if this is a salvageable situation, or if Jake has already convicted me in his mind, and this allowance is not a test, but the beginning of a long, slow, painful end. Update 1. I want to thank everyone who took the time to comment on my original post. The responses were a mix of get out now and try to work it out, but seeing the situation through so many different lenses helped me gain some much-needed clarity. I have now been living on the $1,000 allowance for just over 2 months, and it has been every bit as frustrating and demeaning as I anticipated. I have, however, managed to stay under budget each month, a fact that seemed to genuinely surprise Jake. Last month, my total spending was $940. The month before, it was $1,020, but that was only because I had to replace all 4 tires on my car after running over a nail. Jake has been scrutinizing my spending with the precision of a forensic accountant. He's not just tracking the big purchases, he's tracking everything. He questioned a $12 charge from CVS, forcing me to explain that I had purchased tampons and Advil. He interrogated me about a $25 grocery purchase that was slightly higher than my weekly average, and I had to justify my decision to buy the good, soft toilet paper instead of the cheap, scratchy single-ply that his mother had recommended as a cost-saving measure. And speaking of Linda, her involvement has only intensified. She checks in with Jake regularly, inquiring about my progress with the budget. Last week, she asked him if I had learned my lesson yet about frivolous spending. She also floated the idea that perhaps I should get a part-time weekend job to contribute something instead of just taking handouts. This particular gem was delivered while we were having dinner at her house. The entire meal was a masterclass in passive aggression. She kept making comments about how nice it must be to not have to worry about earning a living. At one point, she looked at me and said, with a sickly sweet smile, that Emma also used to love shopping before she took Marcus for everything he was worth. I finally snapped. I am not Emma, I said, my voice sharp, and I have no intention of divorcing Jake and taking his money. She just smiled serenely and replied, that's exactly what Emma would have said, before changing the subject. Jake, as usual, remained silent, diligently working his way through his pot roast as if he were completely deaf to the conversation happening around him. The car ride home was thick with an angry silence. I finally broke it, asking Jake if he ever planned on defending me to his mother, or if I was simply expected to endure her accusations indefinitely. "She's just looking out for me," he said, his voice flat. "You shouldn't take it so personally." "How else am I supposed to take it?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "Maybe if you proved you could be responsible with money, she would back off," he replied. And that was the moment of absolute clarity. This was never about the money. It wasn't about budgets or Marcus and Emma. It was about the fact that Jake lacks the courage and the respect for me to establish a boundary with his mother. He would rather subject me to this humiliating, controlling experiment than have one uncomfortable conversation with Linda. I decided to conduct an experiment of my own. I have been keeping meticulous records of every single purchase I've made with the allowance money, complete with receipts and detailed notes. Last Tuesday, I presented Jake with a comprehensive spreadsheet of my spending over the past 2 months. It was categorized, color-coded, and included charts showing my spending averages. I showed him, in black and white, that I had been under budget both months and had, in fact, been more frugal than ever. "Is this enough proof for you?" I asked him. "Is this enough to convince you that I am not a gold digger plotting your financial ruin? Can we please end this ridiculous allowance system, go back to our normal joint account, and start having a real, adult conversation about our future?" He studied the spreadsheet for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at me and said he thought I was taking this all too seriously. He claimed the allowance wasn't a punishment, but just a way to ensure we were both comfortable with our financial situation. I pressed him. "What, specifically, will it take for you to be comfortable? What is the end goal here?" He couldn't give me a straight answer. He just mumbled something about needing to continue with the current system for a while longer to see how it goes. That was the night I started seriously looking at apartments online. It wasn't a decision to leave, not yet, but a need to understand my options, to reclaim some sense of agency. A decent one-bedroom in our area costs between $1,400 and $1,600 a month. My salary could cover it, but it would be tight. I also confided in my sister, Emmy. She was horrified and immediately offered me her guest room, rent-free, for as long as I needed it. Her support was a lifeline in a sea of insanity. Part of me still thinks that maybe we should try couples counseling before I make any drastic moves. But another, louder part of me is asking what, exactly, I would be trying to save. A marriage in which my husband views me as a potential threat? A partnership where my mother-in-law is allowed to treat me like a child? I did, however, get some new information about the infamous Marcus and Emma situation. I ran into Marcus at the grocery store last week. He told me that while the divorce was financially devastating, the story Jake and Linda have been peddling is a gross oversimplification. Their marriage had been in trouble for years. He was a workaholic, and she was lonely and overwhelmed at home with 2 small children. She had begged him to go to counseling with her multiple times, and he had always refused, claiming he was too busy. The divorce settlement was expensive, yes, but it was also a fair and legal division of their marital assets. Marcus was sad about the end of his marriage, but he wasn't bitter. He didn't paint Emma as a villain. This revelation made me question everything. What other details had Jake and Linda twisted to fit their narrative? I'm going to bring up counseling with Jake this weekend. His reaction will tell me everything I need to know. Update 2. The conversation about counseling was a complete and utter failure. I brought it up on Saturday morning during a rare moment of peace. I suggested that we see a professional to help us navigate this financial impasse. Jake's immediate reaction was defensive. "Why would we need counseling?" he asked. "We can just work this out ourselves." I pointed out that we had been working it out for 3 months, and the only result was that I was still on an allowance, his mother was still making insidious comments, and we were no closer to resolving the actual issue of our future family plans. He insisted that he didn't see what a counselor could possibly tell us that we didn't already know. He claimed our system was working just fine and that I was getting good at budgeting. I told him that my budgeting skills were not the point. The point was his blatant lack of trust in me. He, of course, brought up Marcus again, that specter that has haunted our marriage for months. He said he wasn't going to be naive and trusting like his friend. That's when I told him that I had spoken to Marcus and that the story he and his mother had been telling was, at best, a heavily edited version of the truth. Jake did not like hearing this. He claimed Marcus was just trying to save face, that I was the naive one for believing Emma hadn't been plotting his downfall for years. When I asked him for a single piece of evidence to support this theory, he had none. The conversation devolved into a circular argument that went nowhere. Finally, he declared that if I wanted to waste money on therapy, that was my choice, but he would not be participating. I told him I would go by myself. He then laughed, a cold, dismissive sound, and asked how I planned to pay for it, since therapy wasn't in my $1,000 monthly budget. That comment was a new level of cruel. "I'll use my own money," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "From my own salary from the job that I work 40 hours a week." He retorted that this was a violation of our agreement. I reminded him that I had never agreed to anything. This system had been imposed upon me. The fight escalated until he said it, the words that had clearly been lurking just beneath the surface. "If you have such a problem with this," he said, his voice cold, "then maybe you should think about whether this marriage is still working for you." I asked him if he wanted me to leave. He said no, but he also said he would not apologize for protecting himself financially. The rest of the weekend was a tense, silent hell. On Monday, I made an appointment with a therapist for myself. I also opened a separate savings account at a different bank, a secret financial parachute. I started funneling $500 from each of my paychecks into it. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a small pocket of freedom that he couldn't monitor or control. Our home life has become a hollow pantomime of a marriage. We are roommates who share a bed. Last night, he asked me if I was happy. I asked him the same question. He said he was happy until all this money stuff started causing problems. I told him the money stuff was a symptom of his lack of trust. He then said that perhaps we just have different ideas about what a marriage should be. He believes it's about being practical and protecting yourself. I believe it's about being a team. Those two worldviews, I'm beginning to realize, are fundamentally incompatible. Update 3. 3 weeks ago, my car started making a terrifying grinding noise. The mechanic informed me that I needed new brake pads, a repair that would cost $320. I didn't have that much left in my allowance account. I called Jake and asked if I could use our joint account for this necessary and unforeseen safety repair. His response? "Why didn't you budget for car maintenance?" I tried to explain that one does not budget for the spontaneous disintegration of their brake pads, but he insisted that I should have been setting aside money for my allowance each month for just such an emergency. I pointed out the mathematical impossibility of creating an emergency fund from an allowance that barely covers basic necessities. He suggested I make better choices about my spending. I ended up borrowing the money from my sister. When Jake found out, he was furious. He said my inability to manage my budget proved his point. I told him the system was designed for me to fail. He then suggested I get a second job if I wanted more money. I reminded him that I already have a full-time job, one that pays me more than enough to cover the damn brake pads, if only I were allowed to access my own money. The fight was biblical. And of course, Linda weighed in. She told Jake that this was a perfect example of why women can't be trusted with finances. Jake repeated this to me, verbatim, without a hint of irony or shame. And that was the moment I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was not a phase. This was him. This was the man he had become, a man who would rather trust his manipulative mother than his wife of 12 years. 2 weeks ago, I found a one-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from my work. I put down a deposit to hold it. I also had a consultation with a divorce lawyer. It would be, she informed me, a simple, straightforward process. No kids, a marriage of less than 10 years, 2 incomes. We would sell the house, split the minimal equity, and walk away. It's funny how a decade of shared life can be so cleanly and clinically dissected by the law. I haven't told Jake yet. I am still, in this moment, his wife. But I think, in my heart, I already know what I'm going to do. Update 4. I moved out 6 weeks ago. There was no dramatic showdown, no tearful goodbye. I simply informed Jake one evening that I had signed a lease and would be leaving on Saturday. He was stunned, genuinely shocked, as if this outcome had never occurred to him. He asked if I was really ending our marriage over a budget disagreement. I told him it was never about the budget. It was about the trust he had so casually thrown away, the respect he had denied me, and his spineless refusal to stand up to his mother. He made a last-ditch effort at reconciliation, suggesting we could adjust the allowance. I told him the problem was the existence of the allowance itself. He asked if I was willing to throw away 12 years. I told him he had already done that when he decided our marriage needed to be built on a foundation of suspicion and control. The packing process was surreal. He helped me load boxes into my car, the two of us moving with a polite, civil distance like strangers. Linda even stopped by to offer a parting shot, telling me I was running away from my problems. For the first and last time, Jake told her to stay out of it. It was too little, far too late. My new apartment is small, but it is a sanctuary. It is mine. I pay my own rent, my own utilities, and I answer to no one. The divorce is proceeding through mediation. We've already received 2 offers on the house. Marcus, the man whose divorce inadvertently triggered my own, reached out to me. He apologized, saying he felt terrible that his situation had been used as a weapon against me. He also told me that Linda had called him months ago, fishing for details about Emma's behavior, trying to build her case against me. She had been on a witch hunt from the very beginning, and Jake had willingly handed her the torch. The divorce should be final in a few weeks. It's an ending, yes, but it also feels, for the first time in a very long time, like a beginning.